Are racists uneducated? You may think you know the answer to this question. You may think it's totally obvious, but it turns out the answer is a lot more complex than it seems like it is on the surface. I started wondering about this because I was talking with a family member. We were talking about a celebrity who just got banned from Twitter and all kinds of other social media for being racist and sexist. And I said, ah, that guy is so uneducated and stupid. And all of a sudden I stopped and I said, wait, is he uneducated? I wonder what the relationship is between people who are racist and their education level. First, you should know that racism definitely has not disappeared in the United States, despite what some people claim. Some people say racism is over and anyone who's claiming that racism still exists is just stuck in the past. That's not true at all. For example, in 2012, the General Social Survey asked whites about their impressions of blacks in the United States. They asked whether blacks experience discrimination. They asked whether blacks don't have as much chance for education as other racial groups do. They also asked whites if they think that blacks have less inborn ability to learn. They also asked, do they think that blacks lack willpower? In all of these questions, they found lots of white people who gave racist answers, saying that black people are lazy or that black people are stupid. Of course, I want to emphasize here, social science has never supported this as reality. Blacks and Hispanics and Asians and whites and any racial group you want to name have equal abilities to anybody else. There is absolutely zero evidence that the color of your skin makes any difference in the abilities of your brain or in your personality, your willpower, or anything else like that. But here we're looking at whites' opinions and attitudes, the myths that they believe, and sure enough, a pretty large percentage of whites believe these myths about blacks. Research has found similar results globally. Of course, in different countries, the racial categories are different, and who might be at the top of the racial hierarchy is different depending on the country. So the racial categories change from country to country, but in most countries, there is evidence of racism, that the people at the top of the hierarchy in that particular country believe that they are born superior in lots of different ways. But what is the relationship between racism and education? As a general rule, what researchers see is that more educated people tend to be less racist. When you ask people on surveys if they believe these myths about other races, the more educated a person is, the more degrees they have, the less likely they are to answer in racist ways on a survey. But before people with degrees just get all smug and click off this video and assume, oh, well, thanks for telling me I'm the best. I want to be clear that researchers aren't sure that this is actually evidence that people who are better educated are less racist. The picture is a lot more complicated than it seems on the surface. Some researchers are convinced that the more educated people are, the more likely they are to lie on surveys and not reveal their true prejudice. Other researchers don't focus on the idea that people lie. Instead, they say that the relationship between education and prejudice really is about something else going on. So let's take each of these ideas in turn. First, let's start with the idea that maybe more educated people lie on surveys more than less educated people do. In 2009, researchers tested the theory that maybe educated people just lie about their prejudice on surveys. They used a super complicated technique that I'm not going to go into here, but it is a technique that has been proven to help people reveal their true feelings on a survey rather than lying and just giving the answers that people think that survey researchers want to hear. And sure enough, the researchers did find that people with higher education did misreport their true feelings on their surveys. When they gave a survey that was just done the regular way, the amount of prejudice that educated people reported was much lower than when they did the survey in a way that would ensure people that they could be confidential in their answers and that it was okay to tell the truth. The number of educated people who reported prejudice went up. On the other hand, other researchers also in 2009 examined this claim as well. They were looking at whether people claimed to vote for Obama when they really weren't going to vote for Obama because they thought maybe people are afraid to say I'm not voting for Obama because other people will think I'm racist if I say that I'm voting for somebody else. So they were able to examine that claim and found that no, educated people weren't any more likely to claim to vote for Obama when they really weren't going to. So are more educated people lying on surveys when they report less prejudiced answers? Maybe, maybe not. Some researchers say yes, other researchers say no. So that's where we've left that question. Some researchers claim that the link between education level and prejudice is really about something else, and this makes intuitive sense. I mean, does anybody really believe that if you get a degree in chemistry, all of a sudden you're going to be less racist? The causal mechanism there is really hard to try to figure out. So a lot of researchers claim no, something else is going on here. Some researchers claim that the true cause of this phenomenon that we're seeing is more immigrant friends. For example, the European Social Survey, which surveyed over 36,000 people, found that when people have more immigrant friends, they do have less prejudice. And it also found that people who were better educated had more immigrant friends. I guess that makes sense. If you go to college, then maybe you meet a lot of other people at college who aren't like you. You end up becoming friends with them, and it destroys whatever stereotypes you would have had about people who are different than you. Other research not focused on education has found similar results. The more friends you have that are different than you, the more accepting you are of people who are different than you. I mean, that makes logical sense. So this theory doesn't claim that educated people are somehow so superior to uneducated people, that educated people are just able to overcome their racism. Instead, this is about your social circle and who you're friends with. And if someone had very low education levels, but also had a lot of friends who were different races or ethnicities than them, they also could expect to not be very racist. There's a whole other train of thought about authoritarianism. This sort of research goes all the way back to the 1950s when some researchers found that people who had more authoritarian personalities were less likely to be prejudiced against Jews. This line of research has continued since then, looking at the relationship between authoritarianism and prejudice. Just so we're all on the same page, let me define authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom, or a lack of concern for the wishes or opinions of others. The thinking goes like this: maybe authoritarian people are more prejudiced, but more educated people are less authoritarian, which then makes them less prejudiced. And in fact, research has found this all over the world. There are multiple social surveys from all over Europe and Chile and the United States that have found this result. One survey that dug into this idea in depth was in the United States. It asked whites their opinions of blacks on 14 different measures. Just a few of these, to give you an example of the sorts of things they were asking, were: how dependable do you think that black people are? How intelligent at school do you think black people are? How aggressive do you think black people are? How violent do you think black people are? How lazy do you think black people are? And etc. 14 different measures. When the researchers just looked on the surface of this data, what they found was that white people with higher education were less likely to believe these hurtful myths about black people. However, when they dug into it more, they had asked questions about authoritarianism, and they found that authoritarianism was actually the cause behind this data. So, for example, most people with higher education were less authoritarian, which then caused less prejudice. And most people with lower education levels had higher authoritarianism, which caused more prejudice. However, when they were able to find people who had high education but also high authoritarianism, those people always had a lot of prejudice. And people with low education, but also low authoritarianism, also had very low prejudice. So the true cause behind this was your attitude towards authority, authoritarianism. These researchers were able to prove that prejudice is caused by an attitude, a personality of authoritarianism, rather than being caused by education. Other researchers have focused in a different direction. Instead of looking at personality or the number of friends you have who are a different race or ethnicity than you, instead, some researchers claim that it's all about money. It's all about financial vulnerability. These researchers say that the higher your education level is, the less likely you are to be competing in the job market with immigrants. So, because you are not competing with them and you don't see them as a threat, you're a lot more likely to embrace immigration and say, yes, immigration is great. It's never hurt anyone, when you personally have never felt threatened by immigrants. For example, there was 2006 research that tested 4 different theories for why people with higher education might be less prejudiced against people who are different than them. And that research found that people who have higher education are less authoritarian, which we've already talked about. But secondly, that people with higher education feel less threatened in the job market by immigrants and people who aren't their same race. They found absolutely no evidence at all that people with higher education have more cognitive sophistication, in other words, that they're smarter, or that people with higher education are more open minded. Those were not factors at all. This research was based on other research in 1994 that tested 6 different explanations for why education reduces prejudice. One, maybe education transmits democratic norms and values, so people with higher education are just more democratic. No evidence for that at all. Didn't find that result. 2, maybe education provides a knowledge base for breaking down stereotypes about immigrants or people of different races. No, that wasn't the answer either. Did not find any evidence for that. Maybe education leads to cognitive competence, in other words, being smart, which allows people to resist propaganda and understand social conflicts. Nope, no evidence for that either. Maybe education fosters an ability to master one's life circumstances and therefore reduces the risk of confronting situations of conflict. Basically, that people with higher education can just put themselves in situations where they aren't going to have any conflict with people of other races or immigrants. Nope, no evidence of that either. Then they tested the theory that education promotes desirable behaviors in conflict situations. So maybe better educated people just know how to behave in a situation of conflict better than everybody else does. Nope, no evidence of that either. This was the only theory that they tested that actually had evidence. This one said High education allows for jobs with high social status, which protects people from direct competition with immigrants in the job market. That was it. That was the only one they found good evidence for. So basically, the higher education you have, the less you have to compete with other groups of people in the job market. So it's very easy for you to feel like, oh, those people never hurt anyone. How could anyone dislike those people? Well, that's easy for you to say if you don't actually have to compete with them. People with higher education are less likely to be racist, to be prejudiced, and to be xenophobic against immigrants. However, this is not claiming that people with higher education are just somehow superior beings to people with lower education. Instead, what we're seeing is educated people may lie better on surveys and not give their prejudiced opinions. Second, it may actually be about educated people having more friends who are different than them. It may be about authoritarianism. Maybe educated people are less authoritarian. And fourth, the more education you have, the less you have to compete in the job market against different groups that you might feel prejudice toward. So, the relationship between education and prejudice is a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than it seems on the surface.